How many of you know what a peace sign is? For those of you who know what it is, what does the sign represent? Most of you would say the sign represents hope, unity, and of course, peace. Now, if you were to have this symbol all over your house, most people would assume that you are a hopeful and peaceful person, right? Now, let's say you had a giant statue of Robert E. Lee. Just as some background, Robert E. Lee was a general for the Confederacy during the Civil War, and he and his monument are a symbol of the oppression of African American slaves during the Civil War. Now, the question is, how would you feel and how would other people see you as if you were to have this statue of oppression in your home? Today, I'm going to be arguing that historical statues that are offensive should be taken down. The main points will cover the symbolism behind the statues, how these statues portray the wrong history of the past, how these generation and the generation to come will be affected by these statues, and finally, what we can do to solve this problem. The statues to the common Black person are a symbol of oppression now and today. The symbolism behind these statues are a negative remembrance of their past. As Michael P. Williams, the columnist of the Richmond Times-Dispatch, when asked about the symbolism behind the statue, then and now, he responded with, "Well, put yourself in the shoes of a newly emancipated Black person in Richmond, some 25 years after emancipation." And you see this massive monument going up. It's hard not to imagine that those individuals were not filled with terror at what they were witnessing. Now, because the statues are being celebrated for their right to have slaves and fight to keep them. And back then, because the statues were built to honor and reinforce white supremacy views. And then we have to question how these symbols of hate towards Black people and African Americans question our views of freedom. Henry Louis Gates, director of the Hcom Center of African American Research at Harvard University, notes that enduring charged symbols of the former Confederacy adds to our fears that instead of embracing the promise of democracy in a diverse society, we want to return to a far more selective time where freedom was circumscribed by race. Where instead of saying the South was just fighting for their rights, some will say it's a symbol of the right to judge people by their race. Now that I've given you a brief overview of the symbolism behind these statues, let's examine how these statues portray the wrong history of the past, and how our generation and the generation to come will be affected by these statues. One of the things these statues do is justify or revise history. When the 11 southern states seceded from the Union, they were clear that the reason was because they did not want to give up slaves. But even after the South lost the Civil War, they decided to revise history and use those statues to justify their story. In an article by the Washington Post, written by James W. Lowen, sociology professor, Lowen cites the passage from the U.S. textbook titled The American Journey. This reading, "The South secedes. Lincoln and Republicans had promised not to disturb slavery where it already existed. Nevertheless, many people in the South mistrusted the party, fearing that Republican government would not protect Southern rights and liberties. And on December 20th, 1960, the South's long-standing threat to leave the Union became a reality when North Carolina held a special convention and voted to secede. Lowen then states the section reads as if slavery was not the reason for the secession, and the publisher did this not to offend the South and lose sales. And their history is a story of treason against their own country and their right to own slaves. And you also have to consider how these statues impact their future generation. These statues justify and institutionalize racism to the younger generation. And the younger generation in the South will be taught their own version of history and see themselves as the good guys. They might even see these people as idols, seeing as if they got a statue for oppressing a specific race, they should receive the same amount of recognition for doing it themselves and justify their actions for their heritage of racism. Now that I've told you how these statues portray the wrong history of the past and how our generation and generations to come will be affected by these statues, let me tell you about what we can do to solve this problem and the other side's view. The proposition I am making is to take down these offensive statues, and an alternative to destroying these historical statues would be to put them in a museum where these statues could receive proper contextualization, which is one of the main issues of today. Most statues aren't given context to what they truly represent. A museum could properly give them the truth of the statue. The other side might try to argue presidents like George Washington and Thomas Jefferson owned slaves, so the statues should be taken down too. Though according to Manoj Shah, a Civil War historian at the University of Connecticut, when it comes to Robert E. Lee, take it down, and that it's important not to go to one extreme to another. While it is true that many of the Virginian founding fathers, Washington, Jefferson, Madison, all owned slaves, we put up their statues not to commemorate for their slaveholding, but for other reasons. But after taking down these statues, we as a society should choose better and diverse figures to represent us, choosing idols based on positivity like Kobe Bryant, or intelligence like Stephen Hawking, or just heroism like Iron Man. Statues should provide a positive representation of our history, and why would we clog that with unworthy idols? Today I've argued that the historical statues that are offensive should be taken down by first explaining the symbolism behind these statues, then how these statues portray the wrong history of the past, and how our generation and the generation to come will be affected by these statues, and finally discussing how we can solve this problem.